Okay, we're all good.
I just need to add wing blenders out there, but go ahead and start.
Well, yes, hello everybody. Welcome to Tech Alley. Thanks for coming. Today, I guess, here to talk about, well, the little things, some of which are really commonly overlooked or ignored for whatever reasons, are really the key to creating basically any software application or project if you want it to be secure. In my experience, most vulnerabilities in your application don't exist because the developer doesn't know how to fix the vulnerability, but isn't really given or taking the time to do so, right? I'm not going to come up here and really teach you how to become a security expert, but what it'll hopefully do is really get you to think about the little things and maybe open your mind to some of what's out there to help make sure your application is secure, you know? And really, you know, by doing these little things, it doesn't really take as much time as most people think, and actually once you get in the process, it'll save you time, right? You want to make sure your application is secure before it gets to your users, right? But I guess first a little about me. My name is Shane Mitchell. Currently I'm the application security architect at Wood Gaming. I'm also co-organizer of the Las Vegas OWASP chapter and the OWASP Vegas Meetup. Father of 2 children. I really don't do social media, all that stuff. Unfortunately, I can't just like, you know, say follow my Twitter feed or something like that. I'm not into all that stuff, but you have my email right there. Feel free to email me, send me a message. I'm always happy to help, answer questions, give guidance, feedback, whatever. Yeah, and I mean, in the years I've been a developer, I mean, I've really had, you know, the luck of being able to work in a lot of different industries, right? That's a lot of different, you know, opportunity to experience different implementations, concepts, designs, and really kind of see what, you know, really challenge my thoughts as I develop as a developer and an IT professional, right? I've had a lot of projects, been told just fix it, you know, that's pretty common, but you know, I'm sure everybody agrees. Most of the time when someone says just fix it, your first opinion is no, I need to rewrite it. But yeah, after countless hours of debugging, more often than not, what I found was it's not just like an issue that makes your application vulnerable. It's a collection of little issues, right? That if it was just the one thing, it probably wouldn't be too bad, but because there's so many things, you know, being rushed, lazy, whatever, just being told to get it done, you know, that over and over again results in a lot of little things, and that results in a path to exposing the vulnerabilities that live in your application. I've talked with a lot of developers in my career from lots of different backgrounds and experience levels. Most, even novice developers, can identify a basic security issue when we tell them to go look for one. Problem is that that's not how the business process works. They're not told to go look for one, right? Instead, they're focusing on running business logic, making pretty interfaces. Because that's what the people who write the checks actually care about, right? That's the business, right? The business creates and drives processes that developers must follow, and it focuses on the items that will directly make them money, right? And that's how they pay your checks. So there's a balance there, but there will always be another deadline. There will always be another, you know, rush to get something else out there. Our jobs as developers, architects, IT professionals, is to make sure that pretty interface, that rock solid logic that we created isn't really held together by proverbial duct tape, so to say, right? You want to make sure that you have a solid process that you follow to make sure your application stays secure, right? You really got to make sure you take the time to ask yourselves a consistent set of questions based on the project you're working on, right? What libraries does this component that I'm using use, right? What are the dependent libraries marked for deprecation of that set of dependencies, right? When's the last time you checked? That's probably the most important thing. When is the last time you checked? The questions that you ask have to be relevant to your task at hand, and because you're usually not doing the exact same thing over and over again, the questions you're going to ask yourself are going to change from task to task, right? Your process is a guide to help make sure that you're asking yourself the right questions. You know, when was the last time you looked for an alternative component to that one, right? You're just updating a component. Maybe there's another one that's the new latest greatest that's going to provide a lot cleaner functionality with less overhead or something, right? What ports and protocols does your system use to communicate with other assets? What other systems would be commonly ran in the same environment as yours that might conflict with, right? There's a lot of thoughts that might be a little abstract, but you got to develop a good process to give yourself the time to ask all the right questions, right? What's the standard? And again, when's the last time you checked? The standards will change often. That's really why it needs to become part of your normal process, is to always double check, right? Everyone works different, but it's important to develop that good process that works well for you so that you can ensure that you thoroughly review the details, right? They're often the little things that I mentioned earlier, those little details, but they compile really quickly if you're not careful, right? Paying attention to those little things, that's how you build a good secure foundation to a feature suite instead of just making this piece of business logic work, right? Plus, I found, honestly, that simply having something documented that says, hey, I communicated with my superior that this is how we need to do it, but this is how you're telling me to do it, saves, the CYA, right? It saves you from taking blame later if for some reason there is an issue with scalability, security, or whatever, right? Luckily there's a lot of tools to help make sure our applications are secure, right? One thing that is really frequently relied upon to assist with the overwhelming amount of things that come with developing applications, there's a lot, are frameworks. Many frameworks exist. Some are purpose-built, like Magento or something like that, or you get generic frameworks like Laravel that are really meant to support whatever you want to build, right? These are great tools. I strongly encourage them to be used when the occasion calls for it. Frameworks provide a great groundwork for your application. A well-maintained framework is going to have several maintainers that ensure it follows like industry best practices and standards, right? A framework is really just like an abstraction layer that creates structured APIs to interact with the underlying components, right? So those underlying components provide special functionalities. Some of those might be baked into the framework, and some might be third-party libraries that the framework utilizes, right? And they're not actually built into the framework. That's done for several reasons. But notably, it offloads the particular functionality that's already been created elsewhere, right? You don't want to reinvent the wheel. That means the framework has to integrate with that library's APIs instead of maintaining the logic of that framework and the nuances that come with updates and protocols and standards, right? There's a lot of great, well-maintained libraries for various things, but unlike frameworks, libraries are often used in small scripts. Because they focus on those specialized functions, they often grow over time to support a wide scope of use cases, right? And in doing that, they inherently find and address security flaws, bugs, issues that make them a great component for a framework to use instead of having to build it into the framework directly, right? When you have, like many tools, right? Once you really learn how to use a framework, it's really easy to find yourself trying to find ways to make that tool or that framework work for you. I know so many people who love Laravel because it's versatile. Everything they get on their plate is a project. Oh, Laravel, new Laravel project, new Laravel app. Might not always be what you want, right? They're great. Important functionalities can be built in, but there's two really important things to consider when you're using a framework, right? One is they may support a lot more functionality than that's going to be used, right? The more features that a framework has that you're not using, the more blind spots you have in your application. Because you're not using those components, you're not worried about updating, patching, paying any attention to those components, right? If you have a framework that uses these components, you want to make sure you're disabling components that you're not using, or ensuring that you're properly securing the framework, right? It's part of really understanding and leveraging a framework properly, right? Using a framework really is making sure that it's secure, like I said, right? And that's something that only needs to be done once, because again, vulnerabilities are constantly going to come out. There's going to be new things happening all the time. You have to be resilient, right? When's the last time you checked again? Which is the second thing really to consider when you're using a framework, right? Is again, they have to be updated. The more components, the more frequent the updates. So if you're trying to use a framework, you really need to make make sure that you have a software development lifecycle process to facilitate that, right? Like a nice, clean CI/CD deployment allows for testing it and cleanly deploying it, and if it fails, not actually deploying it or properly testing. You really want to make sure that when you create an application which has a lot of those components, that you properly test and make sure that you find a good fitting framework, not just the one that you can stand up the project with the quickest, right? But what if you're not creating a whole application, right? What if you're just creating a complex script or a collection of scripts for just some remedial tasks, right? Believe it or not, I actually catch more direct security violations with the usage of scripts than I do with applications, when developing applications. The scripts are everywhere. They perform all kinds of things, right? I'm sure most people in here, I guess, has used it to automate some remedial task, right? You've used it to, provision some instance of some legacy server that you really don't want to have to do the hard way because you always forget that one step and it breaks, right? Or you might have scripts that your CI/CD pipeline uses to do your production builds, right? Unlike frameworks, you usually don't have to worry as much about dependencies, but you don't really have the groundwork already done embedded for you. That means you likely face a different set of questions you have to ask yourself when you're writing and dealing with scripts, right? So does your script access any other resources or systems, right? If so, does it need to do any authentication? Does it output or log anything? Does it rely on any other dependencies, any libraries or technologies, right? And how is your script initialized? That's actually a big one too, right? From my experience, it's very common for most scripts to just be some person, a developer, clicking, to initialize a script, running a shell command or something, right? I know there's a lot of deployment scripts, like I mentioned, but when those are developed, or those are initialized by a system call, but when you're running the application yourself like I call them user scripts, right? It's very common to leave copies of the scripts laying around, hard code credentials in there. They're one-time use throwaways or just some playground code, right? You want to make sure that you control the output of those scripts. Your script provides any type of output, whether it's like a file or like if it leverages the standard outstream, you want to make sure you understand what that output is and clean it up if needed, right? Log files and reports a lot of times will contain sensitive information or other things, right? If it's an error that's happening, right? The errors, the stack trace that gets done by your system in an error might expose the full authentication object, right? If you have a framework, there might be layers around the exception handling, but if you're writing scripts, you can be dumping full authentication objects from that dependence library that you're using, right? If your script authenticates to anything like a database or something, you'll likely see credentials, again, hard-coded in the script. Please don't do that. Seen it way too much. Copies, old versions of scripts laying around. It makes it really easy if somebody does gain access to your system, it's really easy to scan a system and crawl for file extensions, key file names, and look for some juicy file and parse through it and look for credentials or the address for another system on the network that might not have direct internet access that you might be able to poke holes in, right? Your script might be simple. You might not need to worry about it. You might not think you need to worry about it, but it's better, again, to treat every piece of sensitive information as if it were your own, right? If you are writing a script that needs authentication, it's very easy. Almost any language that you're going to write a script in has an easy way to prompt for credentials instead of putting it right in that initialization command, right? If that's put in an initialization command, that's logged in system logs. So if you enter -u and -p and put in the values in your command, you're exposing that command with those credentials to anybody else that has system administration level access to that system. They're going to go look at command logs, and they're going to now see what the access credentials to that system are. That simply, right? So it's the little things again, right?
Can I ask a question about that last slide?
Yeah, sure.
It must be overwhelming for you because I'm just thinking of like a code review, right? Like if I can see when a new big project is pitched to you, hey, we need to connect this POS system to our backend or something like that, right? You can kind of get in the middle of that and kind of negotiate what needs to be done security-wise. But I imagine a lot of these scripts are just like off the cuff, some developer going and doing it without anybody kind of even knowing. So are there tools that you use to scan servers for this kind of stuff? Or is this just stuff you stumble upon and you just kind of,
So that's a great question, right? And part of the reason why I say that it's one of the most common blatant security violations in the AppSec realm from my experience. Because if anybody, a sysadmin, a developer, has a script and they want to defy process, all they have to do is name it blah.txt. What scanner is really going to understand what the file name blah.txt is? Unless you have a tool that is looking inside the content of every file for certain code, which there are tools that do that. A lot of the companies that have that kind of money or have a lot more, I guess, vetted and defined processes. But I mean, there are companies and ways to do that. Not very common. It tends to not be cost effective to the business until the assets are of a certain value, right? That's a little bit lower down on the list when you're trying to secure an environment. It's a lot more difficult to do with a lot smaller potential gain. So it's just not as frequently done, right? If that answers your question, right? Because again, there are tools, but they're not used as much as they probably should be, and they're very slow tools. They have to scan full file systems, right? Really the best way to do it is to make sure that any system that you really want to make sure it doesn't have any scripts like that on there. You have proper monitoring tools to basically anytime there's a file, a read or write or to the file system, it takes and parses it and takes a look to see is this sensitive information, runs it through scanners or whatever. But yeah, again, sorry, it's not as common.
Yeah. So really, it's just maybe more on the lines of policies and procedures and only allowing a few people on those production servers, so there isn't silly things being done.
Yeah. Again, that's why it's a pain point, right? It's really hard to get business to pay for a project that is a lot more expensive because it's so intricate. But in my experience, anyways, right? That's how I've seen it. Let's see. Okay. All right. Earlier I mentioned that you kind of got to frequently look into things, right? Part of that consistently double checking. When's the last time you checked? Is knowing where to check, right? Making sure you have sources you can trust for up-to-date industry standards and best practices, right? If you're thinking application security, you're looking for a reputable source for community-driven content for AppSec. OWASP is really what you're looking for. And for those who don't know, OWASP stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. It's an online community. They produce free articles, methodologies, documentation tools, all kinds of things that just aid in the community for the field of application security. So they were founded in like 2001, and really they're recognized throughout the industry as kind of the go-to reference for Layer 7 security, right? Those of you who don't really know what Layer 7 means is Layer 7 of the OSI model is the application there, right? If you've never heard about the Open Systems Interconnection model, take a look, definitely good to know. Expand your horizons a bit beyond just application development, get you thinking about all the underlying components that your application relies on to communicate with other systems. But OWASP is full of amazing resources, tons of things. My favorite one is the cheat sheet series.owasp.org. Great resource. They have everything from Ajax to XML security to PHP security to they have a JSON web token page on there, and it lists different vulnerabilities in JSON web tokens that I didn't even realize there were until I found it, right? So I love cheat sheets, but this is like the best one ever. Sometimes I'll just randomly go onto there. I'll just click a topic randomly and just read something. Okay, I'm gonna learn something. One time I learned that, okay, hold on, I think I have a note about it. What was it? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, yeah, so there's a lot of PHP specific material too. There's Python material. See if I can find the line. But I gotta remember.
A lot of Java.
I'm sorry?
A lot of Java.
Yeah, there's a lot of Java there. They even have a Ruby on Rails. They have a Ruby on Rails page. Again, Node.js page. There's a lot of good stuff there. I can't find the example. But again, so one example for a PHP one is the default configuration for session name is very common, right? Nobody ever changes that. Please change that if you have a PHP application. One day you're going to find users are getting sessions hijacked, and you're going to trail it back to a vulnerability that was exploited, and find that it's really not exploitable if you follow best practices by not using default values for your application, right? If a framework comes with a value, don't use the default value. There's a default salt that gets that comes packaged in this thing. Don't use that salt for encrypting passwords. You know, change the value of that variable to something else, whatever it is. Don't use the defaults. That's gonna hurt you later. You know, those vulnerabilities, you know, would be there whether you change the default or not. Sometimes, depending on the vulnerability, you know, there's still two things that are no matter what always going to be true, right? Best practice is not to use any manufactured defaults, like I kind of said, right? Any product defaults are no good, right? And then the second, if the configuration has been updated during provisioning properly, like I said, that vulnerability will never get exploited or never be able to be exploited. Or a lot more difficult to be exploited, right? And then that goes back to the layers of security. It's always about layers of stuff. You can't depend on the library, you can't depend on that framework. Always make sure you have logic to protect your application when needed, right? I found it's more common to have a vulnerability that gets identified only when it's exploitable because of some default configuration. Then, you know, you might have a vulnerability. You can't even get to that vulnerability unless you have a path of access, right? And again, that's all the little things. The more of those little things you take care of, the harder it is to get to the ones that you can't get to, or that you can't take care of, or don't have the time to, right? One good example is like Mongo database. I don't know if everybody is aware of MongoDB, but it got a bad rap years ago because sysadmins were leaving the default root password on production systems. And so a whole bunch of Mongo databases got attacked and taken over. And as when I do Mongo, that's bad practice. That's
The default was no password.
the default is no
No,
password.
credentials was the default.
Okay, so part of it was Mongo. I apologize.
If they had a password, it wouldn't have helped anyway, but it was a default anyway.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it still is. I don't think you have to go in and manually set up any sort of user access.
Yeah, that's best practice is only, you know, what's it called? Least privilege access. That's a very, very important concept in IT security. Least privilege access. If you're developing your application, make sure that whatever you're writing, whatever system account, user account, session, whatever, it only has access to exactly what it needs, nothing more. Don't make it have access to something just because it'll make this other thing easier later. That's not the way you do it. That's how you poke holes in your own system.
Just to add to that, like when creating a MySQL user, make sure the subnet mask of that user can only access it from your application server. That way, if there was some sort of way or from some side attack or something, you know, they have to literally be on your subnet or something.
At least don't leave the root change.
Yeah, probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
It is a capital C with an exclamation point.
Okay, so I guess here's where I'll get a little bit more like specific examples on like I said, some of the little things that are overlooked, but that add up quickly, right? Basic things that we likely all encounter pretty frequently, like logging, right? Let's use logging for an example, right? Applications perform complex logic. There's many individual pieces of data flowing around in memory all the time, right? It's best practice to be verbose in your logging. You want to make sure you can properly troubleshoot as quick as you can to get your application back up and running, right? You know, I've seen logs be the source of system compromise before. Log levels are great as long as you're honoring them properly, right? You want to make sure you're logging data, but not logging too much data. You want to be able to adjust a flag to now have debug level logging, only when needed. You don't want to just flood information in your logs at all times, right? Someone's able to somehow gain visibility into your log store, you get access to your system. Usually your logs are just flat files on your application's file system. It's very simple if somebody's able to gain access to a system generally to access that file, especially when the most common cases of somebody gaining access to a production system, they have privileged access to that system. That's what they're looking for anyway. So at that point, user rights aren't going to help very much, but they could still help if you properly, again, think about default configurations, making sure your users only have the access when they need to. Does your system root account need access, or is the account you're using to administer your system need to be root, or should it just have root privilege for the certain aspects of the system to maintain it? That will keep it from having access to your application level files as well, right? So proper separation of resource access, right? So one time I had to look into an issue with a log file size spike, and the monitoring tools. The monitoring tools we had at a company we just acquired were horrible, but at least they had something set up. I think they set something quick out of the box default just to sell the product to the guy who owned our company, but they had something set up. I get an alert talking about log file size spike, so I jump in. Apparently, somebody gained access to a system, was able to access the system environment variables, changed the log level on the environment variables to debug because they had access to the log file, and now they were seeing connection strings for the databases and system connections for this other backend process. And the only reason we were able to catch it is because that system was stood up so poorly that when we got it, it was at 78% load on the file system. The only reason we got that alert is because it peaked over 80% file system usage or whatever. But so we got on there, found out what was going on. It took a little bit of time, right? After about 5 minutes or so, I was able to finally get on. After about 10 more minutes, I figured out what was up. Next thing you know, it took about 2 hours later to get it all fixed. But then here comes the part that people don't think about, right? Something stupid like that happens. Oh, just a couple hours, I got it. But I spent 25 or so hours. I think that's what I billed back, is 25 hours just in after work, making sure that all the other credentials for any system that system is connected to are changed, tightening down the way they access the system, monitoring, throwing additional tools to make sure that they're not regaining access to those systems. There's a lot of work involved after you fix the issue, once there is an issue, right? So do your diligence, lock it down in the front, and you'll be so much more happy in the end when you don't have to do all that, right?
One of the things that we do is, if it's non-system level logging, we have a policy of not storing it on the server. Everything has to be remotely stored.
Yeah.
Not just because of the data that's in it, but potential DDoS attacks will take advantage of the fact that systems are logging and take down the file system, because of the logging that you've done.
Yeah.
But if it's offloaded, say like syslog UDP or something like that, you don't run the risk of the system taking itself down because it's trying to log everything.
But you wouldn't want to use syslog UDP necessarily, because then anybody who has access to that and is on that network with access to a net card has access to that syslog data. So you want to use a secure TCP stream for your syslog data if the application has any chance of, again, dumping sensitive data. But that is a very good point, right? And to that point, even if you have a secure TCP stream for your syslog, make sure your corporation, your company, or whatever is diligent about network monitoring tools. You don't want to just openly allow people to, your admins or your engineers, to have Wireshark on every box in case they need it for troubleshooting. Because if somebody gains access to that box, and I've seen that before, where somebody left Wireshark installed as like the generic anybody user can run this application. So you get access, you don't have access to anything. I can't see the application, I can't see logs. I have access to Wireshark. there you go. Now I see anything coming in, going out, everything. So yeah, be careful about that too, right? Again, least privilege access. Don't put it on there if it doesn't need to have access to it. If it does, as soon as it doesn't anymore, remove that access, right?
So the secretary shouldn't have responder in Wireshark.
Yeah, probably not.
That might be a red flag.
Unless you have a really tech savvy receptionist that's helping, deploy code or maintain firewall or something. So another fun one that's PHP specific is also one of the reasons I don't like XML is really the XML RPC decode function that was I think released in like PHP 7.2, 7.1, 7.2, I don't remember. So I had something that we had to parse like financial reports from a vendor that they gave us via XML docs or whatever, and they were only able to access these financial docs through FTPS. So here's a question: does anybody know the difference between SFTP and FTPS? No? Okay, somebody, go ahead.
Well, one is SSH based, one is FTP based.
Thank you. So one is saying, I have an FTP endpoint. It is password protected. The other one is saying, I have a SSL tunnel connection to this secure FTP endpoint, which then has authentication. So just because secure is in the acronym does not mean it is secure or the best option, right? So anyways, okay, yeah, so, yeah, lost my spots over there. So, okay, so let's go ahead and move on to some examples, right? So here's another good one, right? Anybody who's worked in early Laravel days has probably seen and probably had this exact configuration on their Nginx server. And chances are it was copy and pasted off of a Stack Overflow form somewhere. Because I think there was some like 183 different threads of or it was something, I don't remember the exact number, but there was a whole bunch of different threads on Stack Overflow about Nginx configurations for PHP FPM, because that's a very, very common combination of technologies to serve a web application for. Somebody threw together a conceptual and said, this should work. Somebody said, awesome, copy paste, it worked, put it in production. They then said, this is what I'm using in production. Everybody else started doing it. A whole chain effect. This has a pretty good vulnerability in it, right? So, I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I'll try to explain it a little bit. But this regex right here, parsing the path, that regex, you can be escaped to then have an empty path info variable value. And by doing that, you're able to then assign a new variable into the PHP preloader with the value could be anything that gets executed by the PHP preloader. So you could do anything you want really to a PHP application by exposing that vulnerability in their Nginx configuration, right? So if you have an old, Nginx PHP site, go take a look, see if you have that vulnerability. Make sure that your fastcgs split path info, put it at the bottom. Make sure it's the end statement or something, or change the regex. Go find an updated regex pattern. Verify that your config is secure.
For what it's worth, look at the docs for the actual framework you're using and don't trust anything from Stack Overflow.
Stack Overflow is a reference, not a source of secure code snippets.
There's probably still some sites running this.
And there's somebody scanning the entire planet looking for sites that are
Yeah.
doing.
Doing this.
And that just came from like one dude who decided that he cooked that up himself.
It's a butterfly effect.
Yeah, somebody gave an example to be helpful on a Stack Overflow. Say, oh, here's a concept here. Something like this should work, and that something like this should work actually worked. So take a run with it, right? Just because it works doesn't mean it works well.
To add on to this, so if like about a year ago when they released, if you have an iPhone and they released iOS 14.2, they broke push notifications for the entire planet because everyone did push notifications wrong because they found an example of how to send a message in a push notification inside of Apple Help from a user submitted. This is what works, and everyone did that. There's thousands of articles pointing at it, but it's not how you're supposed to do it, and it broke the planet. So it's not uncommon for this to happen. God forbid it would have been on like some forum for help for PHP on the official PHP site. But look, if the PHP says this is what you do, because that's what happened with Apple.
Yeah. So that's a good point. Even if it is a vendor developer forum or something like that, look at the poster. Do they work for that company? Is it an official answer or is it just an accepted answer?
Also
right?
understand how random expressions work because they can break your planet.
Yeah, regexes are great for some things, but they're scary.
Yeah, I would also say that this is a solid case for having either a reverse proxy or a web application firewall in between your server and the internet. This should not be public. You should not have your server accessible, your front door open to the internet.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We'll talk about it. So like any language, the vulnerabilities that exist in the application stack are usually not easy to exploit if you use best practices, right? So speaking of PHP, I think there were 10 reported vulnerabilities just involving the EXIF PHP extension just in 2019 alone, right? All independent vulnerabilities just on the one extension in 1 year. That extension is a file, like a file reader, or for image files, I want to say, right?
Yes.
And it's very common for PHP to handle images. So if the very first function that you do to validate an input that is expected to be an image file uses an EXIF function, well, that's kind of what you would expect to want to use. Well, now your entryway to your application is your vulnerability, right? That's not good. You don't want your validator to be your vulnerability, right? And so for those of you that don't know, CVE is the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures database, right? So it's operated by the MITRE Corporation with funding from the National Cybersecurity Division of the Department of Homeland Security. It's a system that provides a reference method for publicly known information security vulnerabilities and exposures. It's basically a list of vulnerabilities with identifiers next to them. Each contains like a description and at least one public reference. It's meant to be the way that known vulnerabilities are identified and rated, right? CVEs are authorized by CNAs, which are CVE numbering authorities, right? They're organizations from around the world that are authorized to assign CVE IDs for first-time public announcements of vulnerabilities, right? So it's like big players that they're gonna tip the scale for these companies like MITRE to maintain stuff, like Microsoft, right? Microsoft is their own CNA. So Microsoft, I think, is the number one. I think they're the number one source for CVE announcements or whatever, right? Or something like that. It's a voluntary program. The benefits are just the ability to control the disclosure of vulnerabilities and to help the community make sure they're secure. You can view CVEs and details on MITRE's website at cve.mitre.org. You can search for CVEs. They have CVE data feeds, which are great. For quick reference, honestly, it's great, but I like CVE details. CVEdetails.com is great. Nice interface. It allows you to be able to search by product and vendor. You can search Nginx, and it'll be like, all right, here's Nginx vulnerabilities in 2020, you know? So it's really cool if you're looking at something saying, okay, well, how might I be affected? And give yourself a high level view of what you might be looking at when you need to start digging into the details, right?
We did a pen test recently for a client and found that they were showing what version of Nginx they're using, and then we found here all these vulnerabilities, because it's that easy for a hacker, really. I mean, if you're exposing details about it. But I do like the newsletter, because they'll send you the top ones that come out, and kind of helps you kind of stay on top of your toes.
Yeah. Yeah. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. As soon whatever technology you work on daily, go to Seeking Details, check out that vendor, check out that technology, just check it out. You'll be surprised.
What does CVE stand for?
Common vulnerabilities exposures, vulnerability exposures. I said it before, yeah. Common vulnerabilities and exposures, yeah. So okay, back to more code examples, right? So there's a vulnerability in Python before 3.9.4 or 0.5, 3.9 or something, where the IP address library mishandles leading 0 characters, allowing for attackers to bypass access controls that are IP-based access controls, right? So really, traditionally, security rules on a network are usually IP-based. So it's definitely something that can be compromised if you're not careful, if you're not sure. There's a lot of digging to find out whether you're exposed to something like that. That one has like a 7.5 CVSS score, which is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Just the way to rate a CVE as far as, criticality, right? One being, okay, well, if a miracle happens, they might be able to, see the header in a request or something, right? But then you get like 7.5s, 9s, 10s, which is like, all they have to do is blink wrong and they can run arbitrary commands on your application, right? So very, very important thing to pay attention to vulnerabilities in your application, right? So, okay, so PHP and Python are very often the targets for people talking about application security, right? Because they're very common technologies. Python is very commonly used to expose vulnerabilities. So it's a lot of times target for the other side as well, right? But what about one of the new guys on the block, or the newer guys on the block now, right? So what about Node? Everybody loves Node. What if I tell you that there's an issue with the nappy get value stream function set that allows various kinds of memory corruptions? And really what it is that's a function that's used to return the string length of an input. That's the most common use for it. Again, used most commonly as a validator for an input. Your input validator has a built-in vulnerability that would allow somebody to just completely take your system down, right? That's not a good thing. So if you weren't aware of that, you could go however long with that issue. Your system, you keep crashing randomly. Why does my system keep crashing? Why does my system keep crashing? And then there's just some guy that's bored, whenever he's bored, hits a button pointed at your site and laughs because he goes down for another 2 days. So you make sure you gotta stay on it, right? And a lot of times, things are a lot harder to find than they are to stop in the first place, right? But I can't leave the topic and poking at the different tech stacks or whatever without making sure the Microsoft folks don't feel left out, right? So .NET Core, .NET Framework consistently have vulnerabilities around denial of service and remote code execution. So there are actually 2 distinctly separate remote code execution vulnerabilities in .NET software for when the software fails to double check the context. Where was it? I lost my spot. So for a markup of a file, when .NET Core is looking at the file type for a file, it looks at the file type, does a comparison, never validates that is the actual file type of that file. So if I have an XML file and call it .text, it's going to say, okay, it's text. It's not going to see if it's XML. That example might not be a great example, but if you have a PowerShell script or some binary code, and I say it's JSON and it's binary, it's never gonna know. It doesn't double check, and that allows for remote code execution. And again, there were 2 separate vulnerabilities around that same issue released, I think, within like 2 days of each other, completely distinctly separate. In the end, the single thing that contributes most to your application security is again, best practices and not overlooking those little things. Just making sure you're keeping things up to date as much as possible, making sure your knowledge is up to date as much as possible. Again, when is the last time you double checked? When's the last time you looked? And this slide is for right here. So, I realize that it's not possible to make sure a whole team of developers are just constantly thinking, you know, all the little things and are super security focused. You know, let's be honest, your application would never get released or release new features if everybody's, you know, tied up making sure that the proper, the perfect, you know, SQL injection regex is stuck validating your inputs or something, right? Like that's not where you should spend your time, right? So that is why a WAF or a web application firewall is an amazing tool, right? So this is one you should always have to any publicly exposed application. Even if it is not a production application, if it is publicly exposed, you should have a WAF in front of it. Because as a lot of recent examples can indicate, your whole company can be compromised through a non-production system or workflow. You know, most WAFs come out of the box with default configurations that are going to help make it easy, and they just, here, it's going to protect against the real common things that are not commonly used by your application, right? It's really important when you implement a WAF to cater that WAF policy or that specific configuration on your WAF for your application to recognize the proper traffic flow of your application. And so basically what you're saying is my application should look like this as far as communications. Anything that doesn't look like this, get rid of it. I don't want it to reach my application. Stop it before it hits my web server, right? You could say generic configurations like, you know, if there's any expected SQL injection based on predefined attack signatures, which is a little bit vague, or you could say, I expect a post request of this specific set of headers only from this one particular web page to only this one endpoint, and there should never be a GET request, there should never be a PUT request. It all depends on how granular you want to be able to configure it, and it really depends on how well you know your application, right? So a very well configured WAF will show you that the team really understands well how their application looks, right? In cases where your business may, for whatever reason, be targeted by professionals who know what they're looking for, most WAF solutions can be, again, robustly configured to be very specific to your application, right? And though cost is always a factor, there are free ones out there, right? They'll all have pros and cons, of course, but you always have options. There's a lot of them, right? So Mod Security is one that does have a paid tier you can move up to that has pretty good reviews. IronB was actually built by the team that created Mod Security to be an open source version of Mod Security. So IronB is also a pretty well rated open source one, but it doesn't have a paid tier, right? For those Nginx guys, there's a free one called Naxi, Naxsi. That is really compatible with all Nginx versions. It stands for Nginx Anti-CSS and SQL Injection. It's not going to be the most robust WAF, but it is a very decent WAF specifically catered to Nginx web applications, right? A lot of hosting is being done in the cloud, right? So AWS, Azure, GCP, they all have native WAF options that usually work really nice within their cloud environment, right? So it's always something to think about. But that being said, you really can't expect Amazon to have as well written of a WAF as, say, like Cisco or F5, whose whole business is driven around networking technologies, right? So it's definitely something to keep in mind. AWS they're great, they have a lot of great things. Term I like is jack of all trades, master of none, right? They're very good at what they do. They can maintain compliance, so they have to have a level of stability and everything, but they don't need to necessarily have the most robust enterprise level WAF, because any company that's going to be looking for those crazy complex configurations or portions of a WAF to use, they're usually gonna have a lot of money to spend, and they're probably gonna have, purchase a deal with Cisco or again, like F5 or some other company that really specializes in networking technologies, right? So, no matter what your project need is, just if you need a WAF, if it's publicly exposed, or even if it's not publicly exposed, but exposed to a large set of users that could potentially cause any issues to your application, use a WAF. Large companies have internal applications that are only for team members. You still might want a WAF on there. If somebody's really mad because it's their last day and they're having a really bad week, they might try to do something, you never know, right? Insider threats are a very real thing. I've seen them cause more harm than you would really want to believe that someone's actually gonna do. Kind of feel bad because anybody who does that, it's hard to not get caught. You're gonna suffer consequences, but it's still a lot more common than it really should be, right? But really the key to getting and staying secure is, again, staying informed. To do this, you gotta make sure you have reliable resources and reference them often. Again, OWASP is always a great resource for anything application security related. OWASP.org, if you're trying to just look at more about OWASP, definitely look at it if you're trying to get into AppSec more, maybe get involved with AppSec community. It is community driven, so there's a lot of things you can help out with and get experience while doing it. Again, cheatsheetseries.owasp.org, the best cheat sheet I've ever seen, I've ever used, still use it all the time. Again, there's a PHP configuration section specifically, there's a Ruby on Rails section to get Node. Definitely review the cheat sheet if you have time, so worth it. No matter what stack you work in, you should always, again, stay up to date on vulnerabilities. CVEdetails.com, poke around. It's a little bit of an easier interface when you're getting introduced to that stuff. But pay attention to CVEs that affect your applications and your systems. Very important, right? There are RSS feeds that you can hook up to directly from MITRE, get real-time notifications. There are many great security-focused resources, again, for any stack. It's our jobs as developers to stay informed on current trends, make sure that security is part of the information we're ingesting on a regular basis, right? And on that note, OWASP AppSec Developer Security Summit 2021 is on July 24th. It is a free event. It follows the traditional OWASP Builder, Breaker, and Defender principles. And if you don't really have plans for the 24th, it's free. Might as well check it out. It's worth it. You can learn a lot of good stuff. And with that, I'll turn it over to the audience. Any questions, feedback, thoughts, and anything like share, and again, if anybody needs to reach out or you don't like to you're shy or whatever, send me an email. I'm always happy to answer, always happy to help where I can. I'm always willing to provide feedback and input.
What's the most egregious vulnerability you've seen, kind of work?
Okay, so the same application that got attacked from logs, the day I got the application, I opened up the file. The very first line of code in the application was disabling error logging. Then the second file was an include reference to another file, whose first line was disabling error logging. How are you going to know what happened if you're not logging anything? So that was probably, that's probably one of the top ones.
Yeah, but if you had no error logging,
There's no error.
And that's the thing, you wouldn't think that'd be an answer to security, but following up on something happening is the biggest part of security. Things are always changing. You protect it when you build it, but 99% of an application's life is going to be an operational phase, a maintenance phase when it is in production. So by having yourself set up to secure, operationally secure your system is by far going to be the largest impact that you're gonna see when trying to secure your application.
Have you ever used Snort?
Snort.
It's like a network, it does both network monitoring and, web traffic monitoring, but also does like denial of service, so like, so it comes in and has like a whole database of like IP address bad actors. It can be used like a web application firewall, but also for like port, DDoS attacks and stuff like that.
Okay, so that's one of those like, so.
Like,
yeah,
like Philip.
Okay, yeah, 'cause there's a lot of firewall products out there that it's like instead of saying I'm stick within layer 3 to or 2 to 4 or just 4 to 7, that they'll just do like layers 4 and up or 3 and up or whatever. Yeah.
So like Snort is community based and they do have like rules based that are updated via like patches. So a lot of the times, if you wanted to go that route, not really having URL based, also bad actor based, like, all these IP addresses from North Korea should be sent to my server. Yeah. Stuff like that.
What if Kim Jong-un wants to use your application?
He's like,
He's just gonna use a Chinese proxy, it's fine.
Yeah.
Where does that sit in the stack? Is that in between?
Usually it's on the firewall.
Yeah,
So like
it
I use pfence for my firewall, and it has packages in there like Snort where you can actually just add in, and then it downloads like these configurations that you can just basically say, I want this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. PDFs are not allowed, so like they'll scan like, oh, I need the file type that's coming into the port is a PDF, so just roll it.
This laptop has been sitting since before the pandemic shut down, and I blew it out and dusted it off for this. And I was like, wow, I haven't updated this thing in like a year and a half.
You're a bad security person. You don't have an alert every week that says it'll update all the stuff.
This hasn't been turned on in over a year. I turned it on and it's like, oh, you need to, if you're on a Ubuntu 16.04, you need to upgrade to Ubuntu 20.04. I'm like,
Get ready for me to work after you do
Right.
that.
yeah, that's what I'm not doing. I'm gonna wipe. Yeah. So that's why I have. I have this folder. Keep me because I went through. I was like, back up that and wipe it.
Is that drivers and stuff?
It's just arbitrary files.
I would also say, don't rely on AWS WAF as a solution by itself. It comes with no configuration.
Yes, that's.
You basically have to write your own rules unless you pay for third-party integrations like F5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep it plugged in because can you open up a web browser so we can run the raffle through that? But actually, before we do that, we should do demo time first before we give away the prizes. So, do you have your own laptop,
I do.
Mike, that you wanna?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, this time is just again, thank you, Shane, for doing Shane and I, like 8 years ago, were both scrubs, like, programming with Adam and Ray here. We worked together, and it's funny just how we both were so green back then, and how don't be overwhelmed. Security is an illusion. Like when it comes down to it, like nothing is secure. So don't be overwhelmed by what you saw and thinking, oh crap, everything I built is compromised. It probably is.
That's just.
I know everything I built will eventually be compromised, right? Just the nature of security vulnerabilities eventually coming out and stuff. So it is what it is, but that's like the thing. Technology is a moving target, right? Like you leave. Like I remember one time that happened where we had one WordPress server just sitting off in the corner of the system, and we're like, the sysadmin comes walking up, and he's like, why is this system just trying to blast out emails for? And luckily it was just like some scanner got into the WordPress site, but if it was a little more sophisticated, they could have started sidestepping into some serious PII and other systems that could have really gotten us screwed. So again, it's just, just monitoring, staying on top of
It is
it.
used as a bot for the distributed denial of service attack against Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wells
yeah.
Fargo? WordPress and Wells Fargo?
No.
No, so there was
WordPress.
there was a WordPress vulnerability where you could do remote code execution on WordPress so they would install these Trojans to do attacks. So that every WordPress server that wasn't patched would then attack, they had a distributed attack against Wells Fargo, Bank of America. And so there was a one time, like, remember, like, why can't I get to my bank today? It's because every WordPress server on the planet was attacking Wells Fargo and Bank of America.
Apparently it was, but did not have to.
And they just. What's funny, okay, so there's been a lot of WordPress vulnerabilities for remote code execution and all that. They just released a newer version of WordPress like 3 weeks ago or a month ago because they found basically one of the biggest instances, and they're like, I don't even know how it's gone on this long, and it's like a 9.9 on the CVSS for that, and it's like basically WordPress 3.7 and up. Yeah, you've been pumped.
Well, it's like that Microsoft effect. 80% of the users use it, so all the hackers are trying to get into that, right? Just like now there's a ton of WordPress sites. I just got an email 2 or 3 days ago, WooCommerce, from version 3.3 all the way up to 5, which is like 3 major versions, are all compromised with the SQL injection. And so they quietly sent an email, which isn't quiet at all, to everybody saying, hey, upgrade now before we tell exactly how this hack works, because then all the hackers are going to use it to get it. So yeah, keep yourself up to date. And
That's like the news that HP vulnerability before 7.0, which is called HP 5.4.
yeah, which I'm sure some systems are still running. So we used to do 2 talks, but I wanted to switch it up. We want to do some demoing at the end. If anybody else wants to pitch their demo, side project, whatever you guys got going on, I'm going to open up the floor here at the end. But we do have today Mike Sitt. He's, we used to work for Zappos, good friend of mine, and he said, screw Zappos, I'm going to do my own thing. And so he's been freelance, what, 1, 2 years?
6 months.
Oh, geez, really?
Yeah.
Feels like a year.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it feels like, yeah. But yeah, I mean, he was like, hey, I'm trying to think of a startup, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, do it, man. And I'm very impressed with how far he's gotten. So without further ado, I'll let you take the floor here.
And nothing's more stressful than following an InfoSec talk.
Yeah.
He was like full of self-doubt.
I was going to ask you that question. It's like startups, you kind of care less about that because you want to make money, but it's a double-edged sword, right? So
The good thing about startups is if you have a security mindset, it is so much easier to bake security into your application from the ground up and to make sure your application is built on, again, best practice and standards. If your application is built with operational security in mind, then you're good, right? Take that little bit of extra planning time.
versus dealing with some enterprise monolith at the end that you can't see.
And that's how you have the startup that beats out all these big guys, because these big guys threw something together, threw a bunch of money in marketing, they blew up, and then they blew down, and then they deflated real quick because they couldn't maintain the traffic and user base because they didn't have a good groundwork. Make sure if you have a startup, you have that good groundwork, and then you have that ability to grow more stably.
So, quick question, right? I'm not so much heavy into development, but I'm trying to understand, because having a team like that. So, like, but there's all these vulnerabilities, right? And when you're trying to do development, now everything moving over to the cloud, right? Are they not like AWS and all? Don't they sort of take care of most of the security and infosec?
And that's the
Yeah.
biggest
It's a big
business.
number, yeah. Yeah.
So okay, so this is
It's on the engineers.
Yeah, so it's always on the engineer to secure your application, your system. I'm sorry, I'm like, so if you look at cloud, right? So all 2 extremes are AWS and Azure. AWS by default, you have an asset, cool. You have to open everything to that asset. You have to configure everything on that asset. Azure is the opposite. It says you have something, cool. It's exposed to everything until you lock it down to stuff, right? So doesn't matter what cloud provider you use, you're gonna have to secure your application. The problem with AWS is people commonly go, that's a lot of things to specifically configure access. Here, star, access any. Don't do that. And then Azure, people go, stood up, hey, it works, cool, it works. I'm like, well, you didn't lock it down yet. So there's a give and a take, no matter what cloud provider you go with, don't worry, they're not gonna be secure by default.
Yeah, like the number one vulnerability in AWS is they possess their security.
Yeah.
Banks and everyone are always susceptible to, especially when people are putting like documents. Like
Different job of security called job security.
Was it better to just self-host on like a cluster of PCs running Windows 7?
This.
Okay.
But honestly, it's no different, right? The cloud is just somebody else's computers
Right.
Yeah.
in a data center.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, you can buy application hosting services, which are different than Amazon. Right, where they're gonna do some of that for you, but.
Good for WordPress, right? Get it off your system.
Hey, WordPress.com, they will worry
Yeah.
about updating it, like,
Yeah.
there are places that will host your WordPress site where you don't have to worry about all that crazy shit.
Yeah.
Because there are vulnerabilities every other day because of plugin X and plugin Y.
Yeah.
It's always the plugin.
And if there's only one maintainer and it's this weird guy in like Bulgaria and the last update was 4 years ago, you might not want to use that package or
You'd be
like.
surprised how few maintainers that are on the really big packages,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm a maintainer on Flask, there's 5 of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Buy your open source buddies a beer because they deserve it. Yeah. Those are the true anim heroes. Yeah.
And look for security.md, see if they actually care.
All right, Mike, kick us off.
Yeah,
Pretend there's a
alright.
bunch of VCs in here and we're all.
We're all over there, right?
Yeah.
We're all-
I know, I'm the wrong one, but, no. So, yeah, my name's Mike Smith, I've been coding for about 10 years now, and as Josh mentioned, I recently left Zappos to pursue my entrepreneurial ambitions. So I started building this on the side about 2 years ago, and it's just, it's called SMS Textify. So it's just text message marketing for Shopify stores. And if those of you who aren't familiar with Shopify, they're a huge e-commerce platform. I think they have over 1 million stores, and I know it's grown exponentially during the pandemic. So this is just like my sales site, so we'll just go ahead and just demo. I have my little demo store, so they give you your little My Shopify domain. You can start a free trial or it'll log you in if you're already a user. Let me blow this up a little bit. So once you log in, kind of have this little dashboard, and it pretty much breaks down to about 4 different features right now. So you can send a text broadcast to your subscribers. You can set up automations based on events that people are taking on your store. And then you can create specific segments of your customers based on products purchased or amount ordered or frequency ordered. And then subscription forms. Text messaging has a lot of regulations. They have to explicitly consent to receive text message marketing. Now there's even individual states that are starting to do their own specific quiet hours. So compliance has been, it's been an uphill battle, but trying to stay on top of it. So I'll just give you a quick demo here. So maybe I'll just open up a new window here and go to my little demo store. So here's my little janky theme I built at one time. So this would be my little demo store. Here you get this pop-up. You could have it just be the button down here, or you could have it pop up and you can set the time. So I'll go ahead and just put in my phone number. Cool, and then I have an automation set up, so I should be receiving a text message here in a moment. And so so you have a form here where I'm going to show you. So this is the editor for that form. You can name it, attach it to whatever automations you created. So a new subscriber, like I mentioned, you can have a pop-up button only. And you have your different colors. So if you wanted to customize the open button text color, you can change the text colors. You can change the text that's on there, the typography of all the Google web fonts on there. So you can choose whatever those fonts you want, font size, font weight, etc. So you can customize all that. And then, so once you have, let's see, so we have now, I have my one subscriber, me, So if I want to go create a broadcast to send to me, name this. Any of your different segments that I've created by default, and you open those up. So I fall under repeat customers, so I'll use that one. And you can schedule it. Let's just send it now. And you can upload an image. And then we have little short codes here. There's only a few for just subscribers, but for different automations, stuff you have specific ones. And those are based off of Shopify as a array of webhooks that they'll send. So if there's an abandoned checkout, it will send a webhook to my server, and I'll just process and see if you have an automation tied to that webhook. And so yeah, you can say shop name. Hey, here is a discount for 10% off, and I will still add discount. And this is where you can use existing discounts you've created on your store, or you can create a new one. You can use need code, just do that, or same code for all customers. And I think I have it set to default, so it's one use only, so you don't use the same code and everyone's just repeatedly using it. So you can create that, and then like that short code, use code, and then discount code. Why is that? Oh, we found a bug here. Live demo fun. It likes to submit whenever I click the discount code.
It's the best way to make them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's so weird.
Call it Captain Rocket.
Yeah, and then so you can put in your URL. I even have shop URL. What am I doing? All right, so then it'll show you your number of recipients, estimated credit costs. Credits just tied to, like a multimedia message, takes 3 credits because it does cost more to send multimedia, and then the regular text message is 1 credit. So it equates to about a cent for normal text and 3 cents for multimedia text.
Who sends the text?
Use Twilio. Yep. So you have that scheduled. And it should get them. Maybe go to full screen. Let's see them. My messages. Yeah. I don't know if I want to pull all my text messages to everybody. But I can assure you, here, I show you that one where it's, I don't know what incriminating info I have in my text messages right now. So yeah, there will be, the discount code and stuff like that. The URL, and it does shorten the URL, use a URL shortener so that way it can track attribution. So when they do click that URL, set a cookie in the browser, and then tie it to what automation or broadcast it was sent to. So that way, if you do click that link and you go and complete your order, then I can track here your conversions, how many conversions, how much revenue is generated, so you can, track your ROI on it. And then, yeah, just last, like segments. You can, we only have 1 subscriber here, but right now I just have a few. I'm working on adding more, but like product order, and then you can say contains, and then I'll have the whole list of these mock products in the store. So you can see, people ordered that, or you can do there's collections in Shopify. So you can say, and then it will update how many subscribers, and then you can use that segment to send broadcasts to those specific segments. So if you wanted to send customers who ordered in this collection and they ordered greater than $500, you can create these different segments and use them to send broadcasts. So it's pretty simple. Not so simple on the back end. Looks simple enough, but that's the idea. I'm trying to make it as as user friendly as possible. But yeah, it just launched. It's just got accepted into the App Store 2 weeks ago, I think. So let's see where I'm ranking. So,
So are people consenting to receive text through the Shopify store?
Through the form
Yeah.
that I showed, they're not, yeah, unfortunately, you can't just, take their customers and add them to the list. But what I do is when you have that, and you fill out the subscription form, and you put that phone number in, I take that phone number and I query your store to see if there's customers that have used that phone number, and I tie that customer information. Like I don't store any sensitive, besides name, really, but then I can do order count of products you've ordered and like your order totals, so that way you can use that as segments, but yeah, you're not, as being a Shopify customer doesn't automatically consent you to the text messages.
So you're using phone number as like a customer ID?
Part of it is a customer ID, but, so
I'm
what I do.
thinking like if a phone number got reused.
Yeah, so that's definitely the challenge of it is if you're using it as a customer phone number, using it as a billing phone number,
Or even beyond that, like someone, stops with that phone and that number gets reassigned to a different person.
yeah.
Now they've like consented for
Yeah.
the person.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge around the SMS industry. It's very, and a lot of these penalties that these states are enacting, it's like you're talking hundreds of dollars per violation. So we are incorporated, so just to make sure, in case of anything like that,
Well, what about like somebody, I live in Las Vegas, but my phone number is from Colorado.
yeah, and so what I've enacted is I do have quiet hours set up, so it will only send between 11 a.m. and 8 p.m. Eastern time. So that's kind of just keeps it as compliant as possible. I mean, I know Florida just passed some regulation, where I think 8 p.m. was the latest. So it's not ideal because, there's always gonna be those outliers, like, you only have so much information to go off of, like, you have a Colorado phone number, so you can assume your mountain time, but you might, you're here in Vegas. So that's why I try to just stay in that compliant window between the Eastern time. Yep.
Are users able to, like, with those laws, are users able to opt in or opt out?
Yeah, I mean, like,
Because conceptually, you could ask them, you could give them a preference, like, based on your number, we'll have quiet hours between,
yeah, and I thought about making it, where you can just customize it, set it as a setting.
Yeah.
And I've seen other, competitors, when I've been doing my competitive research, see that they do that, but the idea behind mine is I'd like to make compliance as part of the product, where it's like, you don't have to worry about that, worry about maintaining compliance, because Twilio is a provider, does a good job of maintaining a lot of that, and there are some cheaper bulk SMS carriers, but, they're kind of the biggest, and, they're gonna be on top of it, so I figured long term is probably a wiser decision. So let's see if we're ranking up here. I've had 2 installs, so it's not exactly blowing the world away. Yeah, we're up there, number 4, text message marketing.
Nice.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're
Okay.
doing okay. But yeah, I'm still just, there's some other big competitors like this Postgres. I mean, I think they just raised like 35 million and they have like 60 employees. But I'm like, you know what? Let me compete. I'll get in there, scrappy.
Right.
Feature wise, I'm probably about 75% of what they offer, and I'm like, it's just me. So
You're beyond an MVP in my opinion. I think
Yeah,
you've got
this
a lot of features.
well, I appreciate that. Yeah,
Number
so-
2 is a great spot to be.
What?
Number 2 is a
Yeah.
sneaky little spot to be a lot of times.
Yeah, so we just launched a couple weeks ago, and
Is your business model predicated on subscription revenue from the
Yeah,
App Store
sorry,
plus per text message, or is it predominantly subscription?
It is subscription based, so I forgot to cover that. So it's kind of just, so I started, free plan, because a lot of it's hard. I give 200 free text messages out of the gate, because you can't just, import all your customers and you have this huge list. You have to be able to put this form on there and start generating your subscription list. So it is free to install, and you can just start getting subscribers, and then after you run out of your 200 credits, this is where you would purchase a monthly subscription. So the cheapest one's just $20 a month for 2,000 credits. So it's about send a text,
Per text, or 3 credits for the multimedia
correct.
test.
So it starts with that, and then so you just, and then how I have it set up, so if you don't use all your credits for 1 month, it will roll over for 1 more month, but then after that, you'll lose those rollover credits. So no paying customers quite yet, but we just launched 2 weeks ago, so just trying to generate, some leads.
Do you potentially, I'm not sure about your Twilio integration, but do you potentially see a problem where you may have a customer exploiting, maybe spamming and invalidating your Twilio account when they shut you down? Or do you actually do multiple Twilio?
So what I do for each account that's created, I create a different messaging service from Twilio for that exact reason. 'Cause I don't want one bad actor to just completely ruin it. And right now it's
Well, it's required now too, right? That you can't have multiple businesses going to the same number, sending market messages.
Yeah, exactly. And so when everyone signs up, I take their location and purchase the number based on that. Still gotta figure out the logistics behind the uninstall, each number's like $1, I think, a month.
Right, yeah.
And so it's that's on my to-do list, is to figure out the strategy for that, because there is the short codes. I think they're like
They're a lot.
1,000 a quarter or something every 3 months. But now there's a lot of regulations about short codes, and everyone's migrating away from the short codes, and so.
It's also more expensive because the SMS, the carriers are adding on extra stuff for the short codes.
Yeah, but they do have higher throughput, I think, in regular standard numbers, instead of 1 text a second, where the short codes is 100 a second, I believe. But until I have a client doing some serious numbers, I'm not too concerned about throughput.
Do you have safeguarding against having somebody send messages every second or every minute, or?
I don't currently, but what on the to-do list is is having a safeguard about sending someone the same message within another message within 24 hours, putting limits on, if someone receives something within the last 24 hours, we're gonna skip over them, because you don't wanna be spamming people, but currently, no.
Okay.
And then that's kind of the idea of integrating with Shopify, is hopefully, you have to have at least a paid Shopify subscription, so you have to think at least these people are somewhat legitimate, but there's always going to be that risk. But I'm trying to, there's so many what if scenarios. I'm I'll address this, I'm trying to prepare for as many as I can, but until we get,
So images have to come from Shopify, right? They can't just upload it.
they can't upload their images, so
can?
they can.
That's
It's it's like the user generated content's always kind of stressful, vulnerabilities, and the worst.
So make sure your contract.
Yeah, that's with my terms, it's you're not responsible for any content uploaded.
So how you managing CCPA,
The,
California Consumer Protection Act?
that's a good question. I don't know. I know with Shopify, they do have a lot of requirements to get approved in the App Store, through GDPR and the California, there's an endpoint that you have to have. So if someone requests to get their data deleted or removed, you have to apply it back.
So the webhook will come and tell you to delete this phone number?
Exactly.
Okay.
Or provide them if they request the information you've stored, then I just have an
Okay.
endpoint and I get.
That's actually really cool that Shopify has that.
That's kind of
That's
I feel
pretty
like
boss.
integrating with Shopify and Twilio, I feel like that kind
They
of
cover you a bit.
a little bit, as much as you can hope for, but as you said, the user generated it stresses me out, thinking if there's, porn or, God forbid, worse, criminal.
That's huge though, because we have the problem, you get people coming to us, we're hey, we want to know how much data you have. Who the hell are you? I don't know who you are, I don't know if we're allowed to have this data.
Yeah.
So go talk to people who gave us the data, and then they can tell us to give it.
Yeah.
Because I don't know who you are, I can't verify you say, but the fact that they have that integration makes it so much nicer.
Yeah, and that's a requirement they have to get approved. And that's kind of the nice thing, it's not glued with all these crappy apps they do have, so.
Yeah.
Standards. But that's pretty much
interface,
it.
it's nice and clean.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good fonts,
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Are you on-prem or in cloud?
I'm cloud AWS.
Nice.
Now I'm like, oh, I gotta go look up web
Security
application
groups.
firewalls
Are you in North Virginia or not?
Like, no comment.
Multi-regional support?